It is our incredible honor and privilege today to have with us Sreeram Visvanathan from IBM, Global Managing Director of Government, Healthcare, and Life Sciences, live from the UAE. Sreeram, welcome.
George, great to be here. Thank you for having me.
You know, it's just so incredible to have you on this program today to be talking about so many important issues, especially as it relates to the global issues that we're facing, including, of course, the pandemic. And I guess that's probably apropos to begin talking about that because it's affecting everyone on this planet. To start with, could we talk a little bit about the impact on all of us as you see it? And what have you observed, Sreeram, over the last 3 months? And what do you see as the longer term impact on the industries that you work with each and every day?
Well, George, it's the last 3 months have been have illustrated how fragile the world is, don't you think? It's been really incredible to observe how things that we took for granted every single day in our personal lives and in our professional lives are so fragile. Who would have thought supply chains could not cope with the requirements of the of our healthcare workers, right? That we were so unprepared for something in an era of big data. That's something that we've been talking about for years and years, and yet we go back to basics and we say, okay, where is this disease? How is it going to progress? Why did it take so long for us to get ahead of it, right? Or even to the stage we are at. So I think my first observation is and reflection is how fragile the world is and how much we take for granted. I think technology has helped us in the immediate response to it. It's amazing, 60% of the workforce around the world are working remotely. And if anything, as we were talking about before the show, work seems to have accelerated. I talk with more clients today than when I was traveling 90% of my time. And we are able to do a lot more in a shortened period of time is how I feel. And whether it's remote work, whether it's supporting our healthcare industry, whether it's standing up additional compute power, whether it's using analytics and data to inform decision makers, to influence processes, to decide on resource allocation, we've been in the middle of all of that, right? And those are things that human beings have a tendency, to hunker down and to fight. But then I think we're coming to a stage where the next stage is about recovery and rebuild. And now you're starting to see a massive focus on what many people have termed the new normal. I would call it the new abnormal, because I think we are at least 12 months away from any kind of new normal. But for me, my reflections are some of the things that the UN Sustainable Development Goals talk about have come to light a lot more through this crisis. For instance, global inequality. You watch the news of migrant workers in India or in Africa rushing to return home. You look at things like the pandemic affecting certain segments of society a lot more. You look at global supply chains, urbanization is kind of reducing. You look at mass unemployment, 300 million around the world today. And you see the focus on trying to recover economies. So I think the impact on all of us, George, has just reiterated to me. I mean, of course, leave the technology side of it. I know we'll come and talk about innovation in a minute, but leave the technology side of it. For me, the big impact is the need for all of us in industry, in government, and professionals to focus on the UN's 17 sustainable goals and to really make a dent, to innovate, to think differently about how we can address some of those issues.
Yeah, and just yesterday, I believe it was, the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, came out and made an impassioned plea for that, on the doubling down of helping to achieve the 17 broad goals of the United Nations. And as you know, Sreeram, the 17 goals, were decided on perhaps the only time in the history of the UN where there was unanimity. Every single member, 193 member states, agreed on the broad framework, including the United States, on helping to achieve these broad goals. And what that says to me is it takes the politics out of the goals, which is a really fundamental component of helping to achieve them, quite frankly. And then you're able to just focus on what is the end game. You mentioned inequality. Certainly, according to so many reports from across the planet, there's been an acceleration or at least a highlight of the inequality that is present in certain areas. There's been an increased level of poverty and lack of education. And I think what happens during a crisis like this is there's a light that shines down upon the areas that are most vulnerable, right? And we're seeing that today. And I think that's part of the story of what is the ability to do something transformational at this moment, to address these issues when the light is shining on them directly. When there's, they say sometimes in Washington, I'm sure you've heard this, sunshine is the best disinfectant. In this case, not exactly apropos, but you have a situation where the sunlight shining on an issue gives us an opportunity to understand it better and to help solve it quicker and just in a more comprehensive way. And I'd like to hear from you just quickly on, you mentioned the goals. Do you see what's happening as a setback, or do you see it as an accelerant? In other words, we were sitting in conversations like this in early January across the planet. People were convening, having conversations with 3,500 odd some days to 2030 with this runway to achieve the goals. And suddenly the world changed.
Yeah.
And suddenly you're in the UAE, I'm in Washington, D.C., but yet we're experiencing the same exact thing. Perhaps for the first time in human history, the entire planet is experiencing this, and with the speed of telecommunications and everything else, the awareness of the experience of others is also very, very clear. So are we closer to achieving the goals or further away as a result of what's happening?
I think we've got increased focus. My view is that, and we in industry can't allow that focus to go away, right? Again, a year hence, the danger is we all go back to business as usual. And what we need to do is to remember, this is one of the lessons, this is one of the gifts of this of this pandemic, is that it's brought to light, like I said, how fragile everything is. So if you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, I think we all have an obligation to focus on how technology and innovation can help drive material change towards that goal, towards achieving some level of progress. I would say the last decade has demonstrated we haven't done that, right? I mean, I can take any of the goals. You look at aging population, by 2050, we're going to have 2 billion people around the world over 65. You look at 1% of the global population having 40% plus of the wealth. You look at 65 million people around the world migrating to cities, and yet, as we've experienced through the COVID-19 crisis, when jobs stop, when the jobs have gone from the cities, they're all rushing back to their homes and villages and trying to recover. You look at water scarcity, you look at food wastage. A third of all food that we produce is wasted. So for me, and you look at things like mental health, right? $16 trillion by 2030 is the economic impact mental health. So some societal systemic issues, but underpinning all of that, technology can really make a difference. And for me, it's all about, the limiting factor is imagination. The limiting factor is personal ambition, in my view, towards achieving that. I hope that kind of addresses the question you raised, but I see it as an accelerant. I see it as an opportunity for us to really get to the root causes of some of these issues.
Sreeram, what an incredible insight into this issue, and looking at innovation and the impact of digital technology. Can you highlight the potential that you see for disruption. And how does this address, or how can it address, some of the biggest challenges that we see in society today?
Well, let's come at it from two sides, right, George? I mean, on the one hand, you have some critical technologies that are now more mature, more stable, that we can talk about forever. But I want to talk about how they can address the issue. So cloud, data, AI, open source, blockchain, quantum, 5G, all of those are relevant. It's what you do with them that's really going to make the difference, right? So let's take some examples. Education, for instance. Just a small example, we opened something called a Pathways to Technology curriculum. This was our previous CEO's vision, PTech as it's called, in 2011. So far, 220 schools adopted the program, 150,000 students, 24 countries, 600 corporate partners. But this is open innovation of reinventing education, of allowing those underprivileged to solve a gap that we have in society, which is technical depth, security, what have you. In the new space, we don't have enough talent, right? So now we've just, a couple of months ago, in fact, we launched Open PTech. Now that's one example. I think education as an industry is going to go through transformation. We're going to see more partnerships. We're going to see collaboration. And my son is at university, he's a senior, and I'm not sure that I need to send my daughter for 4 years of undergrad studies, and that's the best thing for her. So as a parent, I wonder if there's a better way of learning. And I think I would hypothesize that in 20 years' time, the education system will go through reform. Let's take another example. Let's think about, we talk about food wastage, right? How about using blockchain to really look at the supply chain? I mean, we're working with Yara, which is an agricultural, company that has a lot of insights, and we're using data analytics, geospatial information to help farmers get the best yield. But if you can connect that with technologies like blockchain to look at matching supply with demand, and to look at how you can get food that's surplus to the people who need it the most. I'll give you another example. Post Hurricane Harvey, we looked at government stimulus funding, for the recovery effort. And we looked at using blockchain technology for one, data, AI, to look at how every dollar of that funding was being used, and did it have the impact it was intended for, because a lot of it does go waste around the world. And imagine if we could do that with charity organizations, where people like you and I who contribute to charity can have line of sight to how that money changed somebody's life, help somebody get educated, get the right medical help. I think we can have massive impact. So for me, I go back to the point I was making around, it's down to our imagination of how technology and innovation can reinvent some things that have been done the same way, but just perhaps digitized. Now we need to challenge how we can leverage insights and data to reimagine the whole thing. I don't know, George, does that make sense to you?
Well, Sreeram, it makes a lot of sense. And I think the ability to reimagine, if you think about this for a moment, to reimagine entire sectors like education, just because something has been done a certain way for so much time or so many years, doesn't mean it's the most efficient way today. Healthcare is another great example of ripe for innovation and disruption. The delivery of healthcare, we are looking at a moment in time when your role actually becomes even exponentially more important, because you're helping to advise organizations, companies, et cetera, across the planet on how they can do things better, faster, cheaper, more efficiently. And I think that is paramount in what we're discussing here, because we were all on this giant treadmill of life in an accelerated fashion in January. I likened it to being on a slide. You know, you're on a slide as a kid and you're moving so fast and everything's going by you. And we had to pause almost instantly.
Yeah.
You know, it was an instant pause. It was like a big stop sign was held up and said, you know, you cannot, you literally can go no further. And again, the planet went into this complete moment of stall. And now we're slowly, to your point, emerging out of this. But how do we then capture, you know, this moment? How do we take this, you know, just disruption, I'll refer to it as, with such an impact and loss of life, et cetera? I mean, just tragic, and learn from it and move and become better. And how do we make, you know, change happen faster? Sreeram, how do we do that?
Well, a couple of things, right? And as a human being, as a member of society, as well as a professional who sees these stories play out all the time, you know, I think we've looked at technology and we apply technology in very incremental fashions, especially in my industries, right? In the industries that I serve, it's always been incremental. You know, here's a process that we've done, put a system in to automate it, to digitize it. We haven't gone back to say, if the founding fathers had all of the wherewithal we have today, would they have designed the structures of government the same way as we have them today? I would argue that they wouldn't, right? And I would argue that they would be a lot more disruptive in designing things so that it's more productive, faster, more agile. So for me, it comes down to leadership. It comes down to the metrics that drive behavior. It comes down to people having the courage and conviction to say, this is not about the technology, but this is about the impact we can create. You can see examples of it all around the world. And I think, you know, the COVID-19 crisis has made more people sit up and think and say, why did this happen? And how can we stop? And how can we contribute? And for me, the fundamental thing is around two things, and they're behavioral. They're not technological. You know, you have a guy from IBM talking about technologies are given, but it's about leadership. It's asking the why question. It's collaborating. It's creating an environment for innovation at scale. It's flattening organizations. And this is the advice that I always give my clients, and this is the conversations I have around how are you creating an environment where, you know, you don't have this reporting layer where it's a pyramid, but you have a reporting layer, or you're creating an environment where ideas are welcome, mistakes are okay, you learn from them, you invent, you innovate, you move on, and technology, you know, is available at scale to facilitate that. I mean, just look at how we are discussing things remotely. You wouldn't have thought this was possible to, you know, 3 months ago.
That's right. That's right. And I think it is this pause is now presenting the ability to do exactly what you just described, is to reimagine and rethink and restructure as the opportunity. And I think leadership is critical. It starts, I believe, always it starts at the top, the ethos and the just that tone. As I mentioned in my recent Forbes piece, tone is very important. And I believe that translates into action, or can translate into action. You work with governments, and you know, I've worked in government as well, and you know, it can be exhilarating, or it can be very, very frustrating when things either move too fast or oftentimes too slow. In this case, cloud. Governments seem to have been very slow to adopt cloud and AI and other technologies compared to what we see as the commercial sector. You've already shared some incredible insights on innovation and how innovation can address global challenges. But what do you see as the biggest obstacles in making this transformation a reality for governments?
Well, I think the cloud infrastructure around the world is getting better, stronger. There's more choice. We talk about hybrid cloud. We talk about not locking people into one particular cloud. At the end of the day, I don't. Again, to my point earlier, I think the infrastructure and the platform and the ability to move applications and workloads to different clouds, all of that is available and can be implemented. I think it's really no longer an IT issue. It's a demand that needs to come from agencies that says, I want to be able to do A, B, and C faster, more agile in sprints, and I'm no longer willing to wait for 12 months to implement a policy. Let's say there's a new benefit that a government wants to implement. Traditionally, that requirement would go to IT and would take forever to implement, right? And what is going to drive the adoption is the demand from agencies and businesses to get faster, more agile, and that's going to drive cloud adoption, in my view. And one of the factors that's actually going to make that happen is you've got more millennials coming into the workforce in government around the world. If you look at just Germany, for instance, a big percentage of government workforce are aging and will retire in the next decade, right? And as they retire, you're going to get a new set of workforce. You're going to get more automation, and you're going to get a new norm because they've lived in a digital world. So they're going to say, why can't I do what I do in my retail world in government? That's going to drive cloud adoption. So for me, that's what we need to do. And people in industry like IBM need to show that some of the traditional fears around data privacy and security and data residency, all of that can be handled. It can be handled. You can give people assurances and protect privacy and data rights and everything else. That's not. It's no longer an unsurmountable issue, right? It's more about opening people's mind to it, and that's where the secret sauce. That's the next hill we have to take.
Well, we've heard some absolutely incredible insights and perspectives from you today, Sreeram, and I'd like to ask you one more question, just to give our global audience a little bit of insight into who you are and sort of your perspective and how you developed it. And so if we could go back to your first day at IBM, what did you find and how have things changed?
Oh, wow, that's an interesting question. I came, like many people who come into IBM, I came into IBM through an acquisition. I was part of Pricewaterhouse Consulting. And, it was like a kid coming into a candy store. I know it's an often used phrase, but when you're a management consultant throughout life, you provide recommendations to people as to what they have to do, what they can do, the art of the possible, but you don't have a hand in actually doing it and taking them through that journey. And companies like IBM give you that platform where you have the best of tech, you have great brains in different fields, whether it's quantum or cloud or the latest in terms of Unix servers or mainframes or security, you'll find somebody who has lived a life in that space. And so, like I said, it's like, being a kid in a candy store. And what I have learned, the experience for me has been the absolute, IBM has been a company that's worked from sending man to the moon to the biggest systems we've put in governments around the world. And we've constantly reinnovated ourselves. And we have an obligation to bring these new technologies like quantum, like AI, into the world in a responsible way, in a way that protects our clients' rights, that allows them to shape society for future generations. And that's what's most exciting about my day today. 20 years later, I'm still the same kid in a candy store at IBM, and I love it.
Well, that is a great way to conclude this interview. What last messages do you have for our global audience in countries all across the world? What would you say to them? How can they find out more about your work. There's so much work being done at IBM, but where would you begin to give them a parting message here?
Well, my parting message to people is it all starts with each one of us, right? I think the UN Sustainable Framework, the 17 goals, laid out, like you said, every country signed up to it. We all agreed on the goals, and it's a true North Star for me personally. And I constantly look at our strategy, look at our offerings, look at the work we are doing around the world, and say, are we making an impact? Are we helping address this? But I think in a time of disruptive innovation, it comes down to the things we individually choose to do and the things we choose not to do. So I strive to be a lifelong learner. None of us have exclusive privilege and right to the greatest idea. And so leveraging the best ideas that come out from around the world and applying it to our situations matters to me. I think partnerships matter. And I think this creating this infectious culture of, perhaps the wrong phrase to use at this time, but creating an infectious culture of innovation for me matters. So I would ask each one of the audience to create that for their teams and for each other. And it's been a pleasure to be on your show, George, and I look forward to talking very, very soon.
Likewise, Sreeram Visvanathan, Global Managing Director, Government, Healthcare, and Life Sciences at IBM, live from the UAE. We thank you so very much for your inspiration, for your shining light today during this time, and for your incredible leadership and innovation. Thank you.
Thank you.